I was standing in line at this coffee shop near campus, scrolling through my phone without really paying attention to anything, when I heard someone say my name. Not like calling out to me, but more like a question, uncertain and surprised. I looked up, and there was this guy, maybe two people ahead of me in line, turned halfway around and staring at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Recognition, definitely, but also something else. Confusion, maybe, or nervousness. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead, warm brown eyes, and he was wearing this faded band tee that looked like it had been through 100 wash cycles. And I had absolutely no idea who he was. My mind started racing through possibilities. Did we have a class together? Was he friends with one of my roommates? Had we met at some party I'd been too drunk to remember? But before I could say anything, he sort of smiled, this shy, crooked thing, and said, "Sorry, never mind," and turned back around. And that should have been it. A weird moment. A case of mistaken identity, whatever. Except I couldn't stop looking at him. There was something about the way he stood. The slope of his shoulders. The way he ran his hand through his hair while he waited. Something familiar that I couldn't place. I got my coffee and sat down at a table by the window, trying to shake it off, but I kept glancing over at him. He was sitting alone at a corner table with his laptop open. But he wasn't really working. Every few minutes he'd look up, and sometimes our eyes would meet for a second before we both looked away. It was ridiculous. I was being ridiculous. But my heart was doing this stupid, fluttery thing in my chest that made it hard to focus on anything else. Finally, after about 20 minutes of this silent staring contest, he closed his laptop, took a breath like he was psyching himself up for something, and walked over to my table. Up close, he was even more attractive than I'd realized, and I could see the faint dusting of freckles across his nose, the way his jaw tensed like he was nervous. He asked if he could sit down, and I nodded, not trusting my voice. He sat across from me and we just looked at each other for a moment. Then he said, "This is going to sound insane, but I think I know you from Tinder." And my brain just kind of short-circuited because I had definitely been on Tinder, had spent way too many late nights swiping through profiles, but I couldn't remember ever matching with him. And I would have remembered him. He was exactly my type, the kind of guy I would have super liked without hesitation. I told him I didn't think we'd ever matched, that I would remember. He pulled out his phone and opened the app, scrolling back through what looked like months of profiles, and then he turned it toward me. And there I was, my profile picture from last spring, the one where I'm laughing at something off camera, wearing that blue shirt that my best friend always said made my eyes look good. I stared at it, then at him, then back at the phone. He said he'd seen my profile maybe 6 months ago and had spent like 10 minutes trying to write the perfect opening message before he finally swiped right. But we never matched. He figured I'd swiped left on him, and that was that. Except, he said he'd thought about me more times than he wanted to admit. Something about my profile had stuck with him. The way I smiled in that picture. The quote I'd put in my bio about finding magic in ordinary moments. He said it had seemed genuine, in a way that most profiles weren't. I didn't know what to say. This beautiful stranger was sitting across from me, telling me he'd been thinking about me for months based on a dating app profile we'd never even connected on. And I was trying to process the fact that I might have swiped left on him. Or maybe I'd never even seen his profile. Tinder's algorithm is weird like that. But sitting there, looking at him, feeling the way my pulse quickened every time his eyes met mine, I couldn't imagine any version of me who wouldn't have swiped right. I asked him what he would have said if we'd matched, what that perfect opening message would have been. He laughed, embarrassed, and said he'd probably overthought it so much that it would have been terrible anyway. Something about books, maybe, because I'd mentioned loving to read. Or maybe a question about the coffee shop in one of my pictures. He said he'd wanted to seem interesting but not trying too hard. Funny, but not like he was performing. Genuine, but not too intense. It was the same impossible equation everyone tries to solve on dating apps. We talked for 2 hours in that coffee shop. The conversation flowed so easily, it was almost unsettling. He told me his name was Adrian, and that he was a graduate student studying architecture, that he'd moved here from Seattle last year, and still wasn't quite used to how flat everything was. I told him about my major, about the creative writing workshop I was taking that was slowly destroying my confidence and rebuilding it at the same time. We talked about our families, our friends, the things we were afraid of and the things we wanted. And the whole time, I kept thinking about the randomness of it all. How we'd existed in each other's orbit on an app designed to connect people, but had somehow missed each other. How, if he hadn't happened to be in this specific coffee shop at this specific time, if he hadn't been brave enough to say my name, if I hadn't looked up at exactly the right moment, we would have remained strangers who almost met. When we finally left, the sun was setting and the air had that golden quality that makes everything feel significant. We stood on the sidewalk outside, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. He asked if maybe he could get my number, and I said yes before he even finished the question. As I typed my contact information into his phone, my hand was shaking slightly, and I hoped he didn't notice. But when I handed it back and our fingers brushed, I saw that his hands weren't quite steady either. He texted me that night. Not right away, but late, around midnight. Just a simple message saying he'd had a really good time talking to me and asking if I wanted to get dinner sometime. I was lying in bed trying to read, but mostly just replaying our conversation in my head. And when my phone lit up with his name, I felt this surge of excitement that made me feel like I was 16 again. I texted back immediately, trying to play it cool, but probably failing. We ended up texting until almost 3 in the morning, that kind of rambling conversation that jumps from topic to topic, where you learn all these random details about someone and somehow it all feels important. Our first actual date was at this Italian restaurant downtown that he'd been wanting to try. I spent an embarrassing amount of time getting ready, changing my shirt 3 times before settling on the first one I'd tried on. When I got to the restaurant, he was already there, waiting outside, and the smile that broke across his face when he saw me made my chest tight. Dinner was perfect in that imperfect way that first dates are, where you're both nervous and trying too hard, and occasionally saying things that don't quite land. But somehow, it all just makes you like each other more. After dinner, we walked around downtown, not really going anywhere, just wandering. We ended up at this park overlooking the river, sitting on a bench and watching the lights reflect on the water. The conversation had gotten quieter, more thoughtful. He told me about his last relationship, how it had ended badly and left him gun-shy about dating for a while, how he'd downloaded Tinder, mostly because his friends had pressured him into it. But he'd never really taken it seriously until he saw my profile. He said something about my smile had made him want to try. I told him I'd been on and off dating apps for years, going through cycles of optimism and disappointment, how I'd almost deleted Tinder about a week before he saw my profile, but had decided to give it 1 more month, how I'd been starting to think maybe I just wasn't good at this, at putting myself out there, at being vulnerable enough to actually connect with someone. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was really glad I hadn't deleted it. Even though we never matched, even though it took 6 months and a random coffee shop encounter for us to actually meet. He said, maybe some things are just meant to happen eventually, even if they take the scenic route. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't the dramatic, lightning bolt moment you see in movies. It was quieter than that. more like a door opening, a realization settling into place. I liked him. Really liked him. And more than that, I wanted to keep liking him. I wanted more nights like this, more conversations that stretched until the early morning, more moments of sitting in comfortable silence watching the river flow by. He must have seen something in my expression because he leaned a little closer, and I could smell his cologne, something clean and woodsy. He asked if he could kiss me, and I said yes, and then his lips were on mine, and it was gentle and tentative, and absolutely perfect. When we pulled apart, he was smiling, and I was smiling, and I felt like my entire body was humming with possibility. We started seeing each other regularly after that, a few times a week at first, then more and more until it got to the point where not seeing him felt strange. We fell into routines without really meaning to. Tuesday coffee shop study sessions where we'd sit across from each other working on our respective projects, occasionally looking up to share a smile or a random thought. Friday movie nights at his apartment, where we'd start out actually watching the movie but usually end up talking through most of it. Sunday morning breakfast at this diner near campus that made the best pancakes I'd ever had. I met his friends about a month in, at a birthday party for his roommate. I was nervous, that specific anxiety of wanting people to like you because they're important to someone who's becoming important to you. But they were great, welcoming and funny and clearly protective of Adrian in a way that made me like them immediately. One of them, Blake, pulled me aside at one point and told me he'd never seen Adrian this happy, this open with someone. He said Adrian had been pretty closed off after his last relationship, but something about me had changed that. The way Blake said it made me realize this was more serious than I'd been letting myself acknowledge. This wasn't just casual dating anymore. This was becoming something real. I introduced Adrian to my friends a week later, and watching him charm his way through dinner with them made me fall for him a little harder. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers, made jokes that landed, helped clear the table without being asked. After he left, my best friend Mason looked at me and said, "Okay, I get it now." And I knew exactly what he meant. But it wasn't all easy. There were moments where I'd catch myself pulling back, getting scared of how much I was starting to feel. I'd been hurt before, had relationships that seemed promising fall apart, and some part of me was waiting for that to happen again. There was this one night, maybe 2 months into seeing each other, when Adrian wanted to have the talk about what we were, about making things official, and I kind of freaked out. Not dramatically, but I got quiet and withdrawn, and I could see the hurt and confusion in his eyes. We were at his apartment, and I made some excuse about having to leave early, and he didn't try to stop me, but I could tell he wanted to. I went home and lay in bed feeling like an idiot, knowing I was self-sabotaging, knowing I was letting fear make my decisions. Mason came into my room around midnight, took one look at me, and told me I was being stupid. He said it kindly, but firmly. He asked me what I was so afraid of, and I told him I was afraid of this being real, and then losing it, of letting myself care this much about someone who might not care the same way back. Mason sat on the edge of my bed and said, "You know, that's how caring about people works, right? It's always a risk, but you've been dating this guy for 2 months, and he looks at you like you hung the moon. He recognized you from a dating app you never matched on. He remembered your profile for 6 months. He's not going anywhere unless you push him away." And then he asked me the question that changed everything. He said, "Are you really going to let fear cost you something that makes you this happy?" I texted Adrian at 1 a.m. and asked if I could come over. He said yes immediately. When I got there, he was waiting at the door, concern written all over his face. We sat on his couch and I told him everything. About being scared, about my past relationships, about how I'd been trying to protect myself by not fully committing. And then I told him that I didn't want to do that anymore. that he made me happy in a way I hadn't been in a long time. Maybe ever. That I wanted this to be real if he did too. He was quiet for a moment. And then he took my hand and said he'd been falling for me since that day in the coffee shop. That he'd been trying to be patient, trying to let me set the pace. But it had been hard because he'd known pretty quickly that this was different for him. Special. He said he wanted to be with me, officially, if I was ready for that. And I was. I really was. Things got easier after that conversation. Not perfect, because nothing ever is, but easier. I let myself relax into the relationship, stopped waiting for it to fall apart. We said, "I love you" for the first time about a month later. It was completely unplanned. We were cooking dinner at my place, attempting to make this complicated pasta dish that was going terribly wrong, and we were laughing about what a disaster it was, and he had flour on his cheek, and I just looked at him, and the words came out. "I love you." He froze, his eyes going wide, and for a second I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. But then his face broke into the biggest smile I'd ever seen, and he said it back. And we kissed there in my tiny kitchen with the smoke alarm going off because we'd forgotten about the garlic bread. That was 8 months ago. We've been together almost a year now, and I still sometimes think about the randomness of how we met, about the Tinder match that never happened, the coffee shop I almost didn't go to that day, the moment he decided to be brave and say my name, all the little coincidences and choices that had to line up perfectly for us to find each other. It feels like the kind of story that's too convenient to be real. Except, it is real. He's real. This is real. We still go to that coffee shop sometimes, sit at the same tables we occupied that first day, when we were strangers playing a silent game of glances and curiosity. Sometimes I think about alternate universes where we did match on Tinder, where we had that first conversation through a screen instead of across a coffee shop table. I wonder if it would have been the same, if we would have connected the way we did. But then I look at Adrian, at the way he smiles when he catches me watching him, and I think maybe it happened exactly the way it was supposed to. Maybe the app was never meant to connect us. Maybe it was just meant to put me in his mind, to plant a seed that would eventually lead him to recognize me in a crowded coffee shop and be brave enough to say something. Last week, Adrian told me he'd finally deleted Tinder. He showed me his phone, the empty space where the app used to be, and said he didn't need it anymore. He'd found what he was looking for. And I realized I had too. Not on the app, not through the algorithm, not through carefully curated profiles and witty opening messages, but through chance and courage and the simple act of looking up at the right moment, through letting myself be vulnerable enough to try, to risk, to fall. People ask us sometimes how we met, and we always smile at each other before answering. "We met on Tinder," I say. "Well, technically we didn't," Adrian adds. "It's complicated," I finish. And it is complicated, the story of us. But it's also simple. Two people who almost met, who were meant to meet, who found each other despite the odds. Two people who decided that the risk of trying was worth more than the safety of staying closed off. Two people who are building something real, one day at a time, starting from that moment in a coffee shop when a stranger said my name and changed everything. Total_char_count 16,847.